Every empire discovers the same problem. You can conquer land with soldiers. You can defend borders with ships. You can terrify rivals with cannon. But sooner or later, war asks a colder question. Who is going to pay for it? In 1694, England answered that question by creating something that looked like a bank. But it was more than a bank. It was a machine for turning future taxes into present power, a bridge between private wealth and public violence. One of the first great prototypes of modern central banking. This is Unseen Hand, revealing the hidden forces that shaped money, empires, and your future. Most people imagine central banks as modern institutions, inflation targets, interest rate committees, press conferences, and careful language designed to move markets without causing panic. But the Bank of England was not born from a textbook. It was not born from peace. It was born from war. The year is 1694. England is ruled by William III, a Dutch prince turned English king, locked in a European struggle against Louis XIV of France. The conflict is known as the 9 Years' War. But beneath the battlefield maps, there is a simpler reality. France is powerful, England is vulnerable, and war is becoming too expensive for the old state to finance. Before this, kings had borrowed, monarchs had taxed, begged, seized, negotiated, and defaulted. They leaned on merchants, sold offices, pawned revenues, and promised repayment when victory arrived. But late 17th century war was different. Fleets had to be built, sailors had to be paid. Dockyards needed timber, rope, canvas, iron, cannon, and food. Alliances required subsidies. Convoys required protection. A naval state could not run on patriotic speeches. It needed money before taxes arrived. It needed trust before victory was certain. It needed credit. And England had a problem. Creditors did not fully trust the crown. They had a reason. In 1672, under Charles II, the crown carried out what became known as the Stop of the Exchequer. Payments owed to goldsmith bankers were suspended. In plain English, the government stopped paying its debts. For London's financiers, that memory mattered. A king's promise was not enough. If lenders were going to advance serious money to the English state, they needed something stronger than royal need. They needed Parliament. They needed taxes assigned to repayment. They needed an institution that could make state borrowing credible. This is the secret beneath the founding of the Bank of England. It was not only about creating a bank, it was about manufacturing trust where trust had broken. In 1694, Parliament authorized a scheme. Private subscribers would raise $1.2 million for the government. The money would help carry on the war against France. In return, those subscribers would be incorporated as a legal body, the governor and company of the Bank of England. The state received cash, the lenders received a charter, and history received a new machine. The government paid interest, commonly given as 8% plus a management allowance. The subscribers were no longer scattered creditors. They became a corporation tied directly to the public debt. That is the key. The bank's first great asset was not a magical vault of gold. It was the government's promise to pay. The Bank of England began as a creditor of the state, and the state in return gave that creditor legal privilege. This is where the story turns dark, because once you understand the mechanism, central banking stops looking like neutral administration and starts looking like architecture. The state needed money now. Taxes would arrive later. So the state borrowed against the future. The bank organized that borrowing, and the future taxpayer became the invisible foundation beneath present war. This was the invention that changed everything: funded national debt. Government debt was no longer just a desperate promise made in crisis. It could become a permanent, interest-bearing asset. It could be serviced by taxes. It could be bought, sold, held, pledged, and trusted. War created the debt. Parliament secured the debt. The bank managed the debt. Private investors collected income from the debt, and the public stood behind all of it. This was not a conspiracy. It was more powerful than that. It was a system everyone could see, but few understood. The bank was hidden in plain sight inside the machinery of taxation and war finance. The Founding Act was not mystical. It was a law about duties on ships, beer, ale, and other liquors, revenues used to secure money advanced toward the war against France. That is how financial power often appears, not as a villain entering the room, as a tax schedule, as a charter, as a clause, as a repayment mechanism. The bank solved a brutal problem. How does a state borrow more than people believe it can repay? Answer: it builds an institution that makes belief durable. Charles Davenant, writing in 1695, captured the fragility of this world when he described credit as one of the strangest things in human affairs, something that exists only in the minds of men, yet can decide the fate of nations. Credit was not metal. It was not a cannon. It was not a ship. It was belief, disciplined by law. And once England learned to manufacture that belief, it gained a weapon France struggled to match. The battlefield was not only in Flanders or the Channel, it was in London's ledgers. Every subscription, every tax assignment, every government security, every banknote pushed England toward a new form of power, the ability to fight with borrowed time. The bank's early notes were promises to pay. They were not modern fiat money in the way we think of it today. They were claims circulating because people believed the issuer would honor them. But that belief rested on the state. The state rested on taxation. And taxation rested on people who had no seat at the table when the bargain was made. The bank did not become a modern central bank overnight. Its monopoly power grew over time. Its lender of last resort role emerged through later crises. Its note-issuing privileges expanded through law, panic, and necessity. But the seed was already there. A privileged bank tied to the state. A public debt made credible through institutional design. Paper promises circulating because the system behind them was trusted. And a government discovering that war could be financed by converting future revenue into present force. This is why the Bank of England became so important. It did not merely store money, it changed what counted as money. A gold coin is simple. You hold it, you weigh it, you test it. But a government bond is different, a banknote is different, a reserve balance is different. These are promises inside a hierarchy of trust. Over time, the bank moved toward the top of that hierarchy. At the bottom were wages, rents, taxes, and bills. Above that were banks and merchants, creating promises to pay later. Above that was government debt, treated as safer because the state could tax. And above that stood the central bank, whose liabilities became the safest form of money in a crisis. This is the deeper mechanism. Central banking is not simply printing money. It is deciding which promises can be transformed into liquidity and on what terms. By the 19th century, Walter Bagehot looked at London's money market and saw the truth. The Bank of England held the central reserve of the system. During panic, everyone ran toward the safest claim. If the bank refused to lend, the structure could collapse. Bagehot's famous rule was simple. In a crisis, lend freely at a high rate against good collateral. But beneath that rule is a darker truth. The lender of last resort is the final pawnbroker of capitalism. When the system panics, it brings its promises to the central bank and asks them to be made liquid. That role was not designed in a single day. It was forced into existence by the structure that began in 1694. War created the public debt. Public debt created deep financial markets. Financial markets created fragile pyramids of credit. Fragile credit created crises. And crises created the central bank as backstop. Different century, same architecture. Think about modern parallels. Today, central banks speak in the language of inflation targets, financial stability, and monetary transmission. But when states face existential pressure, the old pattern returns. Government debt expands. Central banks stabilize debt markets. Bonds become collateral. Reserves are created. Liquidity is injected. The public is told this is technical policy, and sometimes it is. But historically, the machine was born for survival under war pressure. In modern Britain, quantitative easing created central bank reserves to buy financial assets, mostly government bonds. The instruments changed, the metal disappeared, the language became technical, but the skeleton remained recognizable. The state issues debt. The central bank deals in that debt. The financial system treats that debt as safe collateral, and ordinary people live downstream from the consequences. Taxes, inflation, asset prices, bailouts, and the silent transfer of risk from institutions to the public balance sheet. The Bank of England's genius was not that it created wealth from nothing. Its genius was more subtle. It made the future spendable. It allowed England to mobilize resources before taxes arrived, before victory was certain, before the public fully understood the new dependency being created. And once a state learns to do that, it rarely forgets. Power was shifting. From land to paper, from royal favor to parliamentary credit, from coin in hand to promises on a ledger, from armies funded by treasure to empires funded by debt. That shift helped make Britain a global power. Not because Britain always had more gold, but because Britain learned how to borrow at scale. It learned how to make creditors trust the state. It learned how to turn taxes into securities, securities into collateral, and collateral into liquidity. That is the hidden architecture of empire. Not just red coats, not just ships, not just colonies. A balance sheet. The question is not whether central banks are good or evil. That is too small. The deeper question is, when money is built from state debt, who really controls the future? The politicians who borrow, the bankers who intermediate, the markets that demand confidence, or the public that ultimately pays. In 1694, England created a bank to fight a war. But what it really created was a model, a way to bind government, finance, and the future into one machine. The Bank of England was not the end of monetary history. It was the prototype. And every time a modern government borrows beyond taxation, every time a central bank buys government bonds, every time crisis liquidity rescues a financial system built on promises, the old mechanism whispers from behind the curtain. War made the bank. Debt fed the bank. Trust empowered the bank. And once the machine existed, the world would never handle money the same way again. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. We show you where to look.